Welcome to Lord Nightmare channel. We share scary stories with rainy ambience. I hope this video helps you in some way to sleep, relax, or just be entertained for a while. If you enjoy it, please think about subscribing and hitting the thumbs up button to help my channel out. Now let's begin.
It was last summer when I planned my getaway. I had been working nonstop for weeks, so I decided to treat myself to a weekend in a small, quiet town in the mountains. The Airbnb listing was perfect, a cozy little cabin tucked away in the woods, far from the noise of city life. The pictures showed a charming space with a fireplace, large windows offering views of the forest, and rustic decor. The reviews were glowing, with people praising the host for being friendly and accommodating. It seemed ideal, so I booked it right away. When I arrived, the place looked exactly as advertised, peaceful and serene. The air was crisp, the sun was starting to set, and the cabin was just as beautiful in person as it had been in the photos. There was a small wooden porch with a rocking chair, a fire pit, and plenty of space to relax. The host, an older man named Frank, greeted me with a smile. He was pleasant enough, if a little distant, and seemed eager to leave me to my privacy. I didn't think much of it. I was there to relax, so I settled in, unpacked my things, and made myself at home. As the night drew closer, I felt a strange unease creeping in. It wasn't anything obvious, just a slight tension in the air. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence you only get when you're truly alone in the woods. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, staring into the flames of the fire, but something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it. The floorboards creaked, even though I wasn't moving. It felt as though the house was alive, watching me. I shook off the feeling and decided to take a walk outside. The stars were incredible, and the night air was refreshing. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. A small, rusty shed at the edge of the property, almost hidden by overgrown ivy. It wasn't mentioned in the listing, and Frank hadn't said anything about it either. I approached it out of curiosity, but something stopped me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was as though the shed was off limits, like I shouldn't be there. I decided to ignore it for the time being and headed back inside. That night, I didn't sleep well. I woke up several times, each time feeling like something was wrong. The feeling of being watched intensified. At one point, I even heard faint whispers, like voices just out of reach. I convinced myself it was the wind, but the rational part of me couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the house with me. I checked every door and window to make sure they were locked, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I texted Frank to let him know I was planning on staying another night. He replied quickly, almost too quickly, saying, "Make sure you keep the windows closed at night. The woods can be dangerous." It struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I went about my day, hiking through the woods to clear my mind. The scenery was beautiful, and the exercise helped distract me from the strange feeling that had followed me since I arrived. That evening, however, things took a darker turn. After dinner, I sat down to read a book in front of the fire. I was exhausted from my hike and was looking forward to an early night. But just as I was about to settle in, I heard a loud bang coming from the direction of the shed. I froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was a distinct, forceful thud, as if something had struck the shed. My heart started racing. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I grabbed my phone and texted Frank, asking if he knew what the noise was. His reply was short, "Don't go out there. Stay inside." My pulse quickened. Why did he respond so urgently? Why was he so adamant that I stay inside? I was about to go to bed, but the noise continued. A few more bangs, followed by what sounded like muffled footsteps. I debated whether I should call the police, but I didn't want to overreact. Instead, I stayed inside, locking the doors and windows, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. As I lay in bed that night, I could hear faint scraping noises from outside my window. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The noises weren't random. They were deliberate, as if someone was trying to sneak up on the cabin. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly, carefully, stood up and moved toward the window. I peeked through the blinds but saw nothing. Still, the feeling that I wasn't alone was overwhelming. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door. My blood ran cold. It was late, too late for anyone to be out here. I slowly approached the door, wondering who could possibly be knocking. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw Frank standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide. Before I could open the door, he whispered, "You need to leave. It's not safe here." I was paralyzed with fear. "What's going on? What do you mean?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. He shook his head, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Just go. Trust me. You won't be safe if you stay." His voice trembled as he said this, and for the first time, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. His hands were shaking. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and ran out the door. As I turned to leave, I looked back toward the shed, and that's when I saw it. In the distance, behind the trees, I saw a figure standing in the shadow of the shed. I couldn't make out details, but I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't stick around to find out who or what it was. I got into my car, drove out of the driveway, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I later found out that Frank had been renting out the cabin for years but had become increasingly paranoid over the last few months. The local authorities knew about him but never found any concrete evidence. Some people in town said he had a history of unstable behavior, but no one knew for sure what had happened. As for the figure in the woods, I never found out who or what it was. I didn't go back to that town, and I never stayed in an Airbnb like that again. To this day, when I think back on that night, the memories still send shivers down my spine. I'm not one to scare easily, but I'll admit, this story still haunts me. It was a few months ago when I booked a weekend getaway in a remote Airbnb cabin. I needed a break from work, and I'd heard that there was a secluded cabin in the woods, perfect for a little peace and quiet. The listing was simple, a small, cozy cabin on the edge of a national park. The photos showed a beautiful, rustic place, with large windows looking out into thick trees and a quiet, peaceful atmosphere. There were a few glowing reviews, and the host seemed nice enough. So I booked it. Big mistake. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The air was crisp, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind made it feel like I had left the world behind. The driveway leading up to the cabin was narrow, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in on me. When I pulled up, I noticed something strange. The house wasn't like the photos. It looked older, almost abandoned, and there was something off about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The door was slightly ajar, and the lights inside flickered. I hesitated, but I figured it was just an old house, and I didn't want to let my imagination get the best of me. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood and something musty. The air was thick, like it hadn't been properly aired out in a while. As I walked through, I noticed the furniture was worn, some of it a little too old and cracked to be comfortable. The place wasn't filthy, but it felt unloved. There was no warmth to it, no welcoming vibe. The atmosphere was suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. I sent a quick message to the host, Jessica, just to let her know I had arrived. She replied almost immediately, saying, "Make sure to lock the doors before dark. The woods can be dangerous after dark." The message stuck with me. The woods can be dangerous? It wasn't like I was staying in the middle of nowhere. This was a national park. But I shrugged it off. I had the place to myself for the weekend, and I wasn't going to let a strange message ruin my mood. But as night fell, things started to get odd. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone when I heard it, faint footsteps. not outside. Inside the cabin. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but the footsteps were rhythmic, like someone was pacing in the other room. I got up, checking each room, even though I knew I was alone. I was about to head back to the couch when I noticed something even more unsettling. The door to the small basement was slightly open. I hadn't seen it when I first arrived. The host hadn't mentioned it. It didn't seem like a space that should have been accessible to guests. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept down the dark staircase. As soon as I stepped onto the basement floor, I felt a wave of cold, a chill that seemed to sink into my bones. There was a heavy, musty smell, and the light in the basement flickered erratically, casting long shadows on the walls. The place was cluttered, filled with old furniture, boxes, and what looked like long-forgotten belongings. But there, in the far corner of the basement, was a strange, dark shape. A large, wooden chest. It didn't seem to fit with the rest of the junk in the room. It looked out of place. I approached it despite every instinct telling me not to. As I ran my hand across the surface, I felt something sticky. I pulled my hand back, confused and disgusted. I turned on my phone's flashlight and shined it across the chest. There, carved into the wood, was something that made my stomach drop. Symbols. They were crude, jagged, like something scratched in with a knife. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a small metal key, just lying on top of the chest, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. I grabbed it without thinking. The moment I touched it, I heard something. A loud bang from above, like a door slamming shut. I rushed back upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the living room, I found something that made my blood run cold. The door to the back porch was wide open. I know I had locked it before, but now it was open, swinging in the wind, as if someone had just walked through it. I went to close it, but as I did, I noticed something in the distance, barely visible through the trees. A figure, standing motionless, watching. I froze. Whoever or whatever it was didn't move. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person standing far away in the woods. My hands trembled as I locked the door and pulled the blinds shut. I thought about leaving, but where could I go? The nearest town was miles away, and I'd barely arrived. I texted Jessica, telling her about the weird things I had seen and heard. She didn't respond immediately, but I wasn't surprised. The connection was spotty out here. I tried to ignore the creeping feeling of dread that had settled over me. I turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself. But then, as I glanced toward the basement door, I noticed it was open. I swear it hadn't been open when I came up. I had closed it, locked it, made sure everything was secure. But now it was wide open. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the key from my pocket and rushed down to the basement. The moment I stepped into the cold, dark room, I could hear a faint whispering. It wasn't clear, but it was unmistakably human, soft, unintelligible voices, almost like a chant. I walked toward the chest, my hands shaking. I inserted the key into a small lock on the side of the chest that I hadn't noticed before. It clicked open, and I slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing, just a pile of old, yellowing papers. But something was off. One of the pages was covered in what looked like dark stains. The moment I touched it, I heard the sound again, louder this time, a low, guttural voice, as if it was coming from the walls themselves. I turned to run, but then I saw something that froze me in place. The figure from outside. It was standing in the basement doorway, just standing there, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The basement door slammed shut behind me, and I was locked in. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to the door, trying to open it, but it was stuck. It wouldn't budge. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door gave way. I stumbled out of the basement, gasping for air, and ran straight to the front door. I didn't even bother to grab my things. I threw open the door and bolted for my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. In the window, I saw the figure, watching me. So, I never went back to that cabin, and I never stayed in another Airbnb like that again. The experience still makes me shudder every time I think about it. And as for the host, Jessica. She never replied to my texts after that night. I checked the listing again a week later, but it had been removed. I don't know what was in that cabin, or who, or what was waiting for me. All I know is that I'm lucky to have escaped. And I'll never forget the eyes in the window, watching me drive away. To this day, I wonder if I was the only one who made it out alive. I've always been the type to embrace new experiences, especially when it came to travel. I had heard so many great things about Airbnb, how you could find hidden gems in remote areas, tucked away from the chaos of daily life. So when I came across a listing for a cabin in the woods, I thought it was exactly what I needed. The photos looked incredible: rustic charm, cozy interior, surrounded by trees, and far away from the distractions of the world. The host, a man named Alan, seemed friendly in his messages, and the reviews all seemed glowing. Everyone talked about how peaceful the area was, how quiet, and how perfect for getting away from it all. It sounded like a dream, but I should have known better. I arrived just before sunset, and the cabin looked exactly like the photos: beautiful, secluded, serene. But as I pulled up to the driveway, there was an overwhelming feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. I chalked it up to nerves, as I was alone in a remote cabin for the first time. But the first odd thing happened when I opened the door. The house was dark, despite it being late afternoon. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. I tried a few more times, then grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I figured the electricity was just off temporarily, but something didn't sit right. The place was eerily quiet, even for a cabin in the woods. There were no sounds of wildlife outside, no birds chirping or leaves rustling in the wind. Just silence. I texted Alan to let him know I had arrived, but he didn't respond immediately. I walked around the cabin, trying to shake off the unease that was building up. The interior was just as charming as the photos. Everything seemed fine, until I went into the kitchen. That's when I saw it. On the kitchen table, there was a stack of old, yellowing letters, each one sealed with what looked like black wax. I was curious, but a part of me didn't want to open them. I felt an odd pull to them, though, like they were waiting for me to discover something. I picked one up and carefully broke the seal. The handwriting inside was strange, almost childlike, but the words were chilling. Don't trust the woods. He's still watching. Don't stay here after dark. My stomach dropped. I put the letter down and backed away slowly, but something in my gut told me to leave. I texted Alan again, but this time, no reply. Just silence. I decided to go outside and take a walk, clear my head a little. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense and dark, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. It should have been peaceful, but the air felt wrong. There was a heavy stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As I walked deeper into the woods, I started to hear something: distant voices. Soft murmurs at first, like a conversation far away. But as I listened more closely, it became clear they weren't just voices. They were whispers, like people talking to each other in low, hushed tones. I stopped in my tracks. There was no one around. The voices grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be surrounding me. I could feel them brushing against my ears, whispering things I couldn't understand. I bolted back toward the cabin, panic setting in. When I got back to the front door, it was wide open. I was sure I had closed it when I left. Hesitantly, I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin felt colder, heavier. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. But something felt off, like I wasn't alone. That's when I heard the sound. It was coming from upstairs. I crept up the staircase, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, a dragging noise, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being moved across the floor. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it, a door that hadn't been there before. It was old and worn, a wooden door with a rusty handle. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to open it. Maybe I was hoping it would reveal an explanation. But as soon as I touched the handle, I felt a rush of cold air, and the whispering grew louder. I opened the door. The room inside was pitch black. No light, no windows, just darkness. But then, as my flashlight swept across the room, I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner, its back turned to me. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on me, even though it didn't turn around. The flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I needed to leave. I grabbed my things, rushed downstairs, and went to the front door. But as I turned the handle, it wouldn't open. Panic surged through me. I yanked at it again, harder this time, but it was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. That's when I heard a voice, low and cold, coming from behind me. "You shouldn't have stayed." I spun around, but no one was there. The door to the cabin finally gave way, and I ran out into the night, not looking back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, heart racing, still hearing that voice in my head. When I checked the listing the next day, it was gone. No trace of Alan, no contact information, nothing. The house had been removed from Airbnb entirely. I never went back. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that cabin, but I know I was lucky to escape. There's a part of me that wonders if the forest is still waiting for the next person to step inside, to hear the whispers, to face the figure in the dark. And now, I'm asking you, have any of you had an experience like this? Have you ever stayed somewhere that seemed perfect at first, only to find out that something was terribly wrong? If you've had a creepy or terrifying experience at an Airbnb or any other rental, I want to hear your story. Drop your experiences in the comments below, and let's talk about the places that should have stayed hidden. Share this video with your friends, because trust me, you never know what could be lurking behind the walls of a seemingly innocent getaway.